Speaker is Jennifer Blesh, who is also from the School of Environment and Sustainability here at Michigan, and she's here to talk about functional traits in agroecosystems, managing plant diversity for multifunctionality.
That title's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So our agricultural systems are facing major challenges with the convergence of these global crises. At the same time, industrial agriculture is also a major contributor to all of these crises. So with the loss of species diversity in our agroecosystems, the ecosystem processes that used to sustain function have been replaced with chemical inputs that lead to many environmental costs, including eutrophication, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss. And these impacts have resulted from really myopic policies that have focused very narrowly on yield or production over other goals. So in this context, there's really rapidly growing public interest in understanding a really wide range of food system models and how they might enhance resilience or sustainability, particularly through the lens of ecosystem-based management. So all farms are agroecosystems, and they follow principles of ecology. So in my work, I ask questions like this, thinking about how can ecological approaches to food production help us meet both food security goals and goals for natural resource conservation. And in particular, I focus on nutrient cycling processes, especially biological nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen is one of the most limiting nutrients to crop production. Nitrogen fixation is one of the most valuable plant traits in agroecosystems because it supplies a new source of nitrogen to plant fields while allowing us to reduce one of the most fossil fuel intensive inputs to agricultural systems, which is commercial nitrogen fertilizer. So thinking about increasing biodiversity in agriculture, they tend to be pretty low biodiversity systems, especially in dominant contexts. So small increases in diversity of agricultural systems can actually lead to pretty large benefits for ecosystem function, particularly if we increase the diversity of functional groups. So these would be familiar to, oops, hit the right button here. These would be familiar to plant ecologists in the room. But what I'll also argue is that in the context of managed ecosystems, diversity often happens in time rather than in space. So we can think about increasing diversity temporally through crop rotation, and particularly through practices like non-harvested crops or organic nutrient sources that lead to a buildup of soil organic matter and a range of associated functions. So for example, in earlier work that we conducted just west of here in the Corn Belt, we constructed mass balances for nitrogen on farms, and at the field scale, we found that increasing use of legume nitrogen sources in fields correlated with a lower risk of nitrogen pollution from farms. This was on working farms. Similarly, at a county scale over here, you can see that predicted nitrate losses decrease rapidly as the proportion of a county land area in perennials increases, so thinking about things like hay and forages. Now, both of these changes, perennials and legumes, consist of changes to the functional diversity of crop rotation. So again, adding in perennials or non-harvested legume species in this case. So today I want to focus on the importance of these non-harvested crops. This is the basic definition of a cover crop up here, if you're not familiar with it. And cover crops can be very strategically incorporated into cropping systems in windows between cultivation of primary cash crops. So they can often grow in the off-season. Traditionally, they were grown to reduce erosion, but we now recognize that we can get this really broad range of functions from cover crops. And so increasingly, my work is focusing on this question. If we combine different cover crop species together, can we simultaneously enhance multiple ecosystem functions at once? That's the definition of multifunctionality. So research looking at the links between biodiversity and multifunctionality is still quite limited, though you can see here it's increasing quickly. And in the case of cover crops, if we combine cover crop species with complementary traits, like for example, legumes, then we could provide an organic nitrogen source to fields while also providing other functions at the same time, like maybe weed suppression or scavenging and holding on to nutrients. So we've been addressing these questions here in Michigan, thinking about how increasing diversity of farms through cover crops can enhance the function of farms while also reducing their ecological costs. And you all are probably familiar with the fact that the costs are rather large here in the Great Lakes region. In Michigan, currently only 6% of farmers regularly use cover crops, but interest in this practice is very quickly growing. So we've partnered with 10 vegetable farmers in this region just to start out with this work. They're not certified organic, but they mostly manage their farms organically. And we've asked a number of questions together across these farms, and I'll only have time to talk about 2 of them today. So the first one is, do cover crop mixtures enhance multifunctionality compared to a cereal rye monoculture? So cereal rye is the most common cover crop in the state of Michigan and in the upper Midwest. It has low seed cost, and it very reliably establishes in the fall and survives the winter. So we predicted that functional diversity of the mixtures would correlate with multifunctionality, meaning that the mixtures would have greater multifunctionality than rye. So we combined different species of cover crops according to complementary plant traits, in particular biological nitrogen fixation, shoot carbon to nitrogen ratio, and also cold tolerance. So we combined species that could survive the winter with those that couldn't, meaning that their timing of peak growth happened in a staggered way. These were low diversity mixtures of just 2 to 3 species, and this was because that's practical and low cost for farmers. But again, they were designed to really leverage these contrasts in plant traits. The second question was, how do soil properties impact nitrogen fixation from cover crop mixtures? So we actually, across these farms, had a really nice management history gradient. So not just a difference in soil type, like you heard earlier, but actually differences in the levels of soil fertility that were the result of distinct management histories. So biological nitrogen fixation is a symbiosis. You heard about it earlier, I think, from Sarah, and it has an energetic cost. The legume plant has to provide carbon to its bacterial symbiont, and so if there's a lot of nitrogen available in the soil, the legume won't fix as much nitrogen. So we predicted that nitrogen fixation inputs would decrease with higher levels of soil nitrogen availability. Now this has been tested a lot in greenhouse conditions with inorganic nitrogen sources, but very rarely on actual farms, thinking about nitrogen availability from decomposition of organic matter. Okay, so some results, starting with this approach. So to measure multifunctionality, we assessed 3 different ecosystem functions: nitrogen supply, so the input from nitrogen fixation; weed suppression, compared to a no-cover crop control; and nitrogen scavenged or retained in the whole mixture biomass. We assessed that at 3 different threshold levels of the maximum observed level of any function across farms. So for example, the highest level of nitrogen fixation was calculated as 154 kilograms of nitrogen, so 30% of that would be 46. And then this is a simple index from 0 to 3, where you pass this given level if all 3 functions are greater than these numbers here. And so what did we find? Just focus on this one portion of the graph. So you can see that 4 mixtures here are significantly greater. They have significantly greater multifunctionality than the cereal rye monoculture. That's what's shown in this yellow square. And the take-home point is this, that the mixtures provided greater multifunctionality than the monoculture, but only at the lowest threshold level. So that indicates that there are trade-offs among different functions, but also that we need to optimize species selection or thinking about how to manage these mixtures on farms. So first, I'll note that these are actually, even at this low threshold level, these are management relevant levels of these functions. So they're actually a decent start for farmers. But we also tested some unique and slightly strange combinations because they were interested in them. So we're going to be testing this for a broader range of mixtures across farms in the future. We also found that there was a huge variability in the amount of nitrogen that was supplied by biological nitrogen fixation. So we measured this using stable isotope methods, and that was driven largely by the amount of legume biomass that was produced as expected. But the rate of nitrogen fixation, the particular trait in the plant, the proportion of nitrogen that comes from the atmosphere, that varies. And you can see that winter pea, which has the higher slope here, was fixing nitrogen at the highest rate. But ultimately, from a farmer perspective, the amount of biomass that's produced is what's going to drive the function of interest, which is nitrogen supply to the field from nitrogen fixation. So what explains this large variability in biomass across the farms? We use linear regression to model legume biomass within all of those treatments as a function of soil properties. And I'll just show some of these data here. So first, The pea biomass correlated positively with plant-available phosphorus, as one might expect. But we found that both clover and winter pea were negatively correlated with two indicators of nitrogen availability from soil organic matter. So particulate organic matter pools, if you're not familiar with them, there are certain fractions of organic matter that respond on relatively short timescales to changes in management. So they're pretty responsive to management, and they tend to reflect the nitrogen fertility of the soil and its ability to cycle nitrogen internally through microbial processes like decomposition. So this is the physically protected particulate organic matter pool and its content of nitrogen, and this is the size of the light fraction particulate organic matter. And both of these correlated negatively with nitrogen fixation inputs. So these results highlight, first, the built-in efficiencies of legumes, right? This is pretty cool. Even in response to changes in organic matter, legumes can downregulate nitrogen fixation when more nitrogen is not needed. And these relatively high R-squareds, particularly considering that this is environmental data from a small number of sites, I think indicates that this is quite a promising approach for thinking about, on a broad range of farms, we could do a much better job of understanding variability in some of these ecological processes in order to fine-tune or optimize our management of organic nitrogen sources. So to summarize these findings, mixtures with complementary plant traits can increase multifunctionality. More work needs to be done. I hope you picked up from this that nitrogen fixation is interesting because it's not only a particular plant trait that we can measure at the individual plant level, but it's also a really important ecosystem function that is important for sustainability of agroecosystems. So we need to do a better job of understanding how it varies with soil, with management histories, and with competitive interactions among species. And then we can optimize mixtures to enhance sustainability and reduce inputs. I'm just going to flash this up here really quickly. We heard earlier about a systems approach. And in our lab, we're increasingly thinking about multifunctionality, not just through the lens of can we provide multiple environmental outcomes at once, but what about social and nutritional variables? Can we consider all of these things simultaneously? This is an example framework that we developed in partnership with family farmers in Brazil. And the lines are just comparing two communities. And the point here is just to show that, and this is a very simple framework, but you can do all kinds of interesting things where you account for the impacts of different management systems on things like soil fertility, income, market access or equity, or yield stability. So to conclude, ecological knowledge is a really powerful tool for designing more sustainable agroecosystems. There's still a lot we need to learn, especially in terms of specifically how to manage biodiversity for particular functions. And I would argue that on-farm studies are really valuable. They're messy, they're hard to do. The statistics are a little bit sloppier, but the outcomes actually reflect the realistic context in which farmers are operating. And finally, here's my plug for even more interdisciplinary work together with social and other scientists to really identify those leverage points that can help us transform food systems towards sustainability, resilience, and ultimately ecosystem and human health. So with that, I'd like to thank a large number of students in my lab that have helped with this work, collaborators at Michigan State University, funding sources, and just a plug that we're increasingly testing some of these things out at the Campus Farm, which is a really valuable research resource.
Great talk, Jennifer. If Lauren Schmidt could come down and set up your slides, that'd be great. So any questions for Jennifer?
Yes.
When did you get to put these cover crops in the fields, and how long did they get to stay? And could you replicate that on a field with like maize or soybeans?
Yeah, you could. So, well, one of the issues, I'm jumping into the weeds too quickly. So yes, most of these cover crops are planted after crop harvest. Rye is the most common cover crop in this region because it can be reliably established in October even. And then it grows a little bit before winter, survives the winter in a dormant state, and then regrows and is tilled in the spring before planting the next crop. We've been looking at overwintering cover crops and some summer crop mixtures that can fill in these strange niches, like maybe after winter wheat, or sometimes on vegetable farms there are gaps when a field is bare. But yeah, they can fill in a lot of areas, and one of the challenges on the most industrial corn soybean farms is that a lot of the yield gains not only have come from plant density, but also from earlier and earlier planting dates. So without sort of our breeding paying attention to the other functions that species can provide in systems, we've lost opportunities where we could actually insert diversity into farms. It becomes harder and harder to squeeze these crops in as that planting window for corn gets longer. Yeah.
How do you think we can implement these, more sustainable changes on a larger scale?
So a lot of people are looking at that question. It's a huge one. But I would say that even at within the NRCS and nationally, there is just booming interest in things like soil health. And most farmers are aware viscerally, and they look at their soil, whether or not it's performing well, and they understand that their livelihood depends on that soil, that you can't continue forever extracting from it without putting back in some organic matter. So cover crops are sort of rising to the top in terms of something that could be adopted on a really broad range of farms. So before we get to maybe more transformative things like perennial grains or everyone in agroforestry or something. So I would say that the biggest barrier right now to adoption is just the need for cost sharing and incentives. Our current farm bill structure is sort of weak in terms of providing support for this type of diversification, but that could be changed with some changes to policy.
I have a question. So as part of integrating diversity and looking at these different plants, have you thought about integrating livestock and what they can put back to the soil, or how they could process the plants that you are looking at for a small diversified farm?
Yeah, I don't do integrated crop livestock research in my own work, but I certainly think about it a lot, and that is one of the main reasons why we've actually lost a lot of species diversity from our fields, is because of the separation of crop and livestock production. So the need to grow things like perennial forages on the same farm with the animals has been removed. And so certainly having some degree of reintegration could be hugely important for motivating farmers to have more diversity in their rotations to provide diverse sources of feed for animals.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.